Welcome, everyone, to the Bible Lore Podcast. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Dr. Susan Ackerman. Susan is the Preston H. Kelsey Professor of Religion at Dartmouth, and she's the author of many academic works and several books, including Gods, Goddesses, and the Women Who Serve Them, When Heroes Love, The Ambiguity of Eros in the Story of Gilgamesh and Stories of Gilgamesh and David, and 2022's Women and the Religion of Ancient Israel from Yale University Press. Susan, welcome, and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So just to get straight off the bat, one of the issues we run into in studies of this sort of ancient period is that many of our writings, they're codes, royal business documents, religious texts, etc. They're made for and by cultural elites, and within that cultural elite, mostly men. So we have two sets of kind of cultural filters and prejudices that we're dealing with right off the bat that excludes most non-elites, and then an additional layer that excludes women. So we see that in the Bible as well. Probably, I think the estimates are fewer than 10% of the named people or people mentioned in the Hebrew Bible are women. And when they are mentioned, it's usually in relation to the men in their lives, husbands, fathers, brothers, etc. So something you point out in one of your books is that in a sort of liminal period, say something of great social unrest or a transition from one era to the other, or there are many ways we can consider a period liminal, or
Mhm.
transitional, or however we want to label it. Even in some of the more extremely man-centered texts of the Hebrew Bible, like Judges, we can see women being praised for occupying some roles that were traditionally excluded. They were excluded from. So, since we're talking in this episode about the era where the book of Judges is set, can you talk a bit about Deborah and where she fits into that?
Sure. So let me just first say you're absolutely right. I am someone who has written about the way that in periods of transition or periods of unrest, there are opportunities for women that are maybe not available in more socially stable periods. I think listeners from the United States might think of World War II and the Rosie the Riveter phenomenon, right? When did wasn't it all normative before the war or after for women to do that kind of factory work? But I want to give credit where credit is due. That idea was originally put forward by two feminist scholars who've been incredibly influential on me, Carol Myers, recently retired from Duke University, and Joanne Hackett, recently retired from the University of Texas. So I don't want to sound more brilliant,
Sure, sure. And
as
Carol
brilliant as
Myers
they
is
are.
phenomenal
So
too.
putting
So
that
yeah,
out there.
absolutely.
Yeah. But I have thought a lot about how that insight might apply to the book of Judges. And it's a little tricky. One of the big reasons it's tricky is Judges in the written form that we have it probably post dates the historical period we would think of as the time of the Judges by as much as 600 years. Maybe, according to some people, even more. 600 would be my number. So that's a long time for a
Sure.
text to go through editing, redaction, modification, etc. That said, one of the really distinctive things about Judges is that it's God embedded in it in chapter 5, this really remarkable poetic text, often called the Song of Deborah, that many, many biblical scholars, myself included, would tell you is much older than the rest of the book.
Often considered one of the oldest texts in the Bible. I think that and Song of the Sea are usually the
Right.
two prime candidates. Yeah.
Right. And so, what's interesting about that text, or from the point of view of the question you asked me, is that text is called the Song of Deborah somewhat pragmatically because it begins with the words, and Deborah sang. And then it's a hymn celebrating a victory in battle. But as the hymn goes on, it becomes apparent that Deborah is not just a singer. The hymn really understands her as a major figure in terms of taking on a leadership role in that battle. And even though she has a male cohort named Barak, she always shows up first. It's always Deborah is listed first and then Barak. And she's the hero. She's the military hero in a culture where military prowess is normally associated with men. And then in the aftermath of the battle, which in at least I think the standard reading of the poem, the Israelites win the battle. One of the enemy generals escapes, and he escapes and takes refuge at a tent of a woman named Yael, and then she finishes off what Deborah had started by rather gruesomely putting a tent peg through Sisera's head.
Right.
So it's a remarkable. And did it really happen that way? Did all this really happen? I can't tell you that. I wasn't there. But I can tell you that the Israelites in 1100 BCE, in this period that is a period of transition before the establishment of the Israelite monarchy, it's a fairly unstable period. The Israelites generate a piece of literature that puts two women at the fore of that narrative, and that's an extraordinary thing for a patriarchal culture to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and the thing is that a lot of the Hebrew Bible is very, especially even the historical writings, it's very difficult to parse through what is history, what actually happened and what didn't. Standards of history really did not exist in the same way. I mean, even into like, I don't know, late antiquity, you still had people putting pretty absurd things into what was otherwise considered very sober histories, and that's 1,000 years off plus from where we're at right now and from when this text was composed, based on your dating. Um, but it is that's the thing that's so remarkable to me is that this story, however it got started, it gets passed down and put into this book in a place that is otherwise extremely exclusionary to women. It very much limits the roles that they're allowed to be in, and yet you get this story that, I mean, when I was a kid, it was one of my favorites because, you're a young boy growing up. It's, you like all the gore and the violence of judges. And I've always found it remarkable. Something interesting that I thought of is you see something similar with in real history with like Harriet Tubman, for example. She was given actually a command over a unit that actually went on a combat raid in the South, which is kind of like, it's one of these things where these things do happen in times like this, in times of great need and crisis. Absolutely, these kind of social structures get, they get to bend and sway a bit beyond the normal constraints.
Right,
So
right.
now that we've gotten a little bit into kind of how women can exceed some of these expectations, especially your work on women in the religious and just in general in ancient Israel, what were their roles kind of like? One of the things, again, we kind of have to peer behind the text, because so much of it is very limited. As maybe we can start with kind of cultic functions that they may have had, religious functions in the temple. I guess we can start with, and then maybe move on to in the household and kind of unofficial, I guess, religion you might call it.
So we know, we certainly have biblical texts that talk about women within the context of temple worship. And since the Bible cares most about the Jerusalem temple, although there were other temples in ancient Israel, we know most, or we hear most about women in the Jerusalem temple. We hear, I would say, when we hear more specifics, first we hear indications of women doing probably what women would have done in context elsewhere, only doing it in the temple. So I'm thinking, for example, of 2 Kings 23:7, where women are said to be in the temple compound, and the temple is a building and courtyards and et cetera that surround it, right? But they're said to be somewhere within the temple compound where they're weaving garments for the goddess Asherah. So
Yeah.
all kinds of things going on there. First, it seems to be a moment in Israelite history where the goddess Asherah is being worshipped in the temple alongside the God of Israel. But that's a different question. But women who are the primary textile producers across the board in ancient Israel, right? Whether we're talking a household context or wherever, here are women outside a household context doing the same kind of, if you will, women's work that they would have been doing at home. They're weaving. In other instances, we see women in the temple singing. We have this instance in Psalm 68 of young drum playing maidens who are making music, singing in the temple and making and drumming and making music. And that's a thing we know women do elsewhere. We just talked about the Song of Deborah, right? So we know that women can be musicians in multiple contexts in ancient Israel. And here's a temple related context where women just bring that work that they do elsewhere into the temple. Another thing that women do throughout the culture, and again, we have many indications of this, is they perform mourning rites when someone dies. So, in that regard, it's not surprising that in the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 8, verse 14, we find this verse about women in the temple performing ritual mourning over the death of the Mesopotamian god Tammuz. And again, there's a theological issue there about what's this Mesopotamian god being recognized in the Jerusalem temple complex. But in our context, when we're thinking about women, I think one of the things you're seeing there is that cultural role that women play as mourners when in very traditional funerary rituals in a village context or in a town context, in a community context, that's moved into a religious context. And we see women kind of expanding their domestic work as mourners into a ritual work as mourners, in the same way we saw women expanding their domestic work as weavers into ritual weavers, or women expanding their broader work as music makers into making music in the Jerusalem temple.
I guess from there, that's a great jump off point too. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is that the boundaries between what is religion or not, or even if that term's useful, I usually try to use cult instead, which is a term with its own problems, but it's kind of a tricky thing because these were seen as also kind of government functionaries to an extent when it was in terms of the official cult, right?
Right. Although, yes, although one of the things definitely to notice about the three examples I just mentioned is, with the exception of the young women playing frame drums who are said to make music within a temple procession, the women who are mourning and the women who are weaving do so in the outskirts of space, on the outskirts of the courtyard, as well as we can map it. And it has interested me to think about the question of the degree to which women are restricted in terms of their access to the central temple space in ways that men are not, and certainly the ways that priests are not. I personally have been particularly interested in thinking about this in terms of women's other major role in Israel, which is, of course, to be wives and mothers. Childbearing is said in cultures across the Eastern Mediterranean and West Asia. Childbearing is said to be polluting. It makes a woman impure. And what impure means is that you can't go into sacred space. So it interests me that the women who can most come closest to the most sacred part of the temple, the young maidens who are drumming, seem to be unmarried, right? They're young maidens. They're almot in the Hebrew. They're not yet of childbearing age, or they're not yet married and childbearers. And so they don't have the potential to pollute sacred space the way childbearing women do.
Typically, it's menstruation, childbearing, and I mean, sex, and a variety of other things that can be considered pollutants to the sacred space.
Right. Although sex is more of a male pollutant than a female
Yeah,
pollutant
good
because
point.
it's a seminal emission that pollutes.
Right, right, right.
Yeah. So at any rate, all I'm trying to say here is we definitely have indications of women being present in the temple compound and engaging in religious ritual in the temple, but they're not as integrated within that space as say Hannah is in a much more rudimentary sanctuary space in Shiloh, according to the story in 1 Samuel 1 and 2. And that interests me that the more formal the space becomes and the more bureaucratic the space becomes, the more institutionalized the space becomes, the more, as you say, sanctioned by government entities the space becomes, the less able women are to exercise authority and power within that space.
And that gets me into kind of my follow-up question to that, which is when I introduced this, one of the things that I mentioned is that probably the primal exclusionary aspect that kind of filters out people in the biblical text is class based first and foremost. And these are texts for and by scribal cultures in city centers, and so we do not see the majority of people represented. And so I guess going beyond that, what do we know about kind of the quote unquote, the unofficial cult, the cultic functions of women who live outside of the town? Because I assume we have things like local shrines that people mostly are using, probably a variety of gods, especially in the early period before there were any crackdowns on that sort of thing.
So we don't know, with an emphasis on the
Sure,
no,
sure.
a whole lot.
Yeah.
But we can speculate, and I think we can speculate in some ways that bring us to some helpful inferences. So, a text that I've been very interested in is back to the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 17, verses 1 through 5, we get this story of the mother of a man named Micah. And for whatever reason, the story starts in the middle, so we don't know why. She has 1,100 pieces of silver. Women typically didn't hold property in ancient Israel, but here she is. She's got 1,100 pieces
Yeah,
of silver. She's living in the same household as her son, that is typical, not typical for women to have property, typical to live in the same household. So
sure.
she's living in the same household as her son, and her son steals the silver. She then utters a curse, cursing who she doesn't know the son has stolen the silver. She just utters a generic curse that whoever stole her silver should be cursed. Her son confesses at that moment, and she reverses her course by uttering a blessing. And more important, and this is the point of this, taking 200 of those 1,100 pieces of silver, giving them to a metalsmith, and commissioning the metalsmith, who is male, to make what's called a cast metal image. And it must be an image of a deity. That's who you make cast metal images. You don't make statues of yourself or whatever. So it must be an image of a deity. And given that her curse has been in the name of the God of Israel, Yahweh, and given that her blessing is uttered in the name of the God of Israel, Yahweh, it makes sense that it's a statue of Yahweh. Now, I know Exodus says don't make graven images, but again, what the Bible says and what people do are not necessarily the same thing.
And what the Bible says and what the Bible says elsewhere is not always the same thing.
But here's a woman commissioning a religious image, which then I think the most logical reading of the text ends up in what is called the household shrine of her son Micah in verse 5. That is, she's not just commissioning this image, she is providing a furnishing for the household shrine. And given what we know archaeologically about the scarcity of metals in ancient Israel and their preciousness, a cast metal image of the God Yahweh has got to be the most precious image that's in that shrine. There are others. The text goes on to talk about other stuff that's in the shrine, but she's got to put the best thing in the shrine. She's the patron of the shrine, and I take that as a pretty extraordinary story about, again, did that story really happen? I can't tell you, but I can tell you the biblical authors imagined it to be possible because it must have rung true with what was possible in the world in which they lived.
And she's not condemned from that for that in the text.
Oh,
It is not proscribed.
no, not at
This is one of
all.
the most fascinating parts of this to me is that, for all of the proscriptions and some would call inquisitions of later Israelite Judahite especially cult, that there are these surviving bits that we can see through the lines that where these people do what was probably standard and what was probably completely fine at the time that would later, I mean, in the same book sometimes be considered, completely disallowed and grounds for all sorts of nasty punishments, whether real or simply imagined. It's one of these fascinating things where when you actually get close to the text, you can see that and it makes it a lot more human to me, I guess, is the part that I really like about this is it you can actually get glimpses. It's no longer just, well, what does the Bible say women can do? What does this text say that this person can do? It gets beyond kind of some of this rote caricaturizing. Something Irving Finkel talks about quite a bit is that we end up almost stereotyping people into when we read these texts and especially texts that are so filled with law books and condemnations, and you end up saying, oh well, this must have been what these people are like. If you closely read on a lot of this, you can see past that and see maybe glimpses of who people actually were. It's a lot more human, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. One of the, comparisons I like to use to get my students to think about this a little bit, especially when you think about legal text in the Bible and their, you can and you can't, thou shalt not kind of things, is to say, within modern day Christianity, perhaps one of the more legalistic traditions is Roman Catholicism, because there are dicta that come out of the Vatican of you shall not. And the example I often use with my students is birth control, right? Is technically Catholic women aren't supposed to use birth control. But if you start asking, especially in the Euro-American West, right, Catholic women do use birth control, the percentage who do is quite high. So what the authorities say you should do and what the practitioners actually do are two very different things often.
Absolutely, and sometimes I think, especially with the biblical text, a lot of the times they're dealing with kind of what we might call in modern terms retconning or academically retrojecting some of these laws into the past that probably did not exist then, that no one would have been aware of. Particularly considering that, again, a lot of the texts that we have were scribal. They were for, by, and most of the time, most likely only made aware of to the city elite, which is kind of a very limited audience in those times until the last, I don't know, couple hundred years. Most people did not live in cities, so it's a very kind of exclusive group that is aware of a lot of this, and it's hard to figure out what was common and what wasn't.
And even if you did, you couldn't read.
Sure.
Literacy rate is non-existent. Well, I shouldn't say it's non-existent, but the literacy rate is amazingly low, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we get texts in the Bible that make this quite obvious. Is Jehoiakim gets a letter? Is it Jehoiakim? When sorry, it's not a letter. When Baruch brings the scroll that Jeremiah has read, it has to be read to the king,
Right.
He can't read, right? So if the king can't read, you better believe that I don't know, person who's selling tomatoes on the corner at a market stall can't read.
Absolutely. And I mean, how much more folks who lived, again, farmed or were pastoralists who took care of sheep in the countryside. So, to move beyond Judges a little bit, in one story from the Exodus, also typically dated to late Bronze Age or intermediate collapse period, Bronze Age collapse, well, chronologically dated, as Moses is returning with Zipporah, his Midianite wife, to free the captive Israelites from Egypt, they are suddenly accosted by God, who is trying
Mhm.
to kill Moses
Yep,
for not
that's how I would read it.
circumcising their son, probably. So, I guess what's going on here, and what is Zipporah's role in this incident, and kind of how does that sort of flaunt the received wisdom oftentimes about roles for women?
Well, what is going on in this incident is a mess, right?
Yes.
but but the incident, Moses is he has been commissioned by God that his job is to return to Egypt and free the Israelites from bondage, and then somewhat paradoxically rather and paradoxically and enigmatically at a lodging place along the way, Yahweh, the God of Israel, met him and sought to kill him. And the hymn would hypothetically refer to Moses' son Gershom, but I think the far more obvious reading is it refers to Moses. This threat, so here's the paradox, right? Hi, I want you to go free my people from Egypt, but oh, by the way, I'm going to kill you
I'm going to
first.
kill you.
Yeah. This threat is averted when Moses' wife Zipporah takes a flint, circumcises Gershom, her son by Moses, and then does something with the flint. Says is said to touch it to Moses' feet.
The flint
Feet,
or the foreskin?
yeah, yeah. So the feet in the Bible is often a euphemism for genitalia. And this is typically read that she is either symbolically or actually circumcising Moses. And many interpreters would then go on to say that if Moses is going to liberate this Hebrew community from Egypt, he needs to carry with him the ethnic marker of that Hebrew community, which is circumcision. And so until he has that circumcision, whatever God has said at the burning bush or wherever, it's not good enough. He needs the circumcision as well. I'm not as vested in that particular thing. What interests me is that Zipporah does it.
Yeah. I mean, as far as we know, were there any other female priestesses, or I guess we could call them moils today? And that is almost exclusively been the purview of men.
Yes, absolutely. There are passages in Second Maccabees, which of course is a book deeply concerned with issues of circumcision because it becomes a way of persecution in the period of the Maccabees when they're being persecuted by the Hellenistic ruler Antiochus Epiphanes. Um, but there are passages in the Greek that could be read to suggest mothers circumcised, but the Greek verbs are passive verbs. So, like
Okay.
all passive verbs could be read, that's a passive verb. So, read by whom? Was circumcised by whom? But yeah, it's basically anomalous to have Zipporah being a circumciser. And it's interesting in that regard that Zipporah's father is a priest. Um, it has been interesting to me to think about the way Zipporah gets positioned there, and to go back to one of our earlier conversations, in a very liminal space, a lodging place along the way. Where is that? You know, in an otherwise undefined space and time, kind of out of regular societal structures, Zipporah gets to step in and play what is otherwise a very male role, and in her family would have been a priestly role because her father's a priest. So
Yeah, I mean that's so fascinating, and then it gives this odd phrase about being a truly you are a bridegroom of blood,
Right,
um,
exactly.
which
And
I
she utters that, right? I mean, it's
yeah,
a very kind of liturgical phrase, whatever it
it's
means.
fascinating. Again, these are so interesting to me because just like with I think it was Micah's mother that we were talking about earlier, these are essentially magic phrases being uttered by women. It's a very liturgical, magic, religious, whatever you want to call it, kind of phraseology that is meant to be apotropaic, ward off harm, or we're not even sure on some of these, but it's very fascinating to me that these kind of things survive through all of the editing and redaction that the texts go through.
Although it's equally worth remembering that in the Exodus story, for example, the moment, so that all happens.
Yeah,
You're a bridegroom of blood to me. Everything is okay. God backs off. No longer is Moses being threatened with death. In fact, the very next verse is that Aaron comes out, Aaron's Moses' brother, comes out to meet Moses, and there's a warm family reunion. Zipporah disappears. I mean, she just
never
disappears.
mentioned again.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and ditto Micah's mother. She disappears. She makes this cast metal figurine. She puts it in the shrine of her son's house. It must have been the most precious object there. And then she just disappears from the story. It's like these women get these little, it's almost like just these little snapshots. And then the movie goes on and their cameo is over.
It's these vignettes that again we have to, and scholars I think like yourself are very good at kind of really digging through to find it, because again we whatever was there, if there was any other tradition beyond that, we are not privy to it. There is very little beyond that. And I know there are some other stories, yeah, that came down in much later years past the Hellenistic period about, I think, Moses's other wives. I'm not sure if there are any that I can recall that survived about Zipporah, but I'm
Yeah,
not like an expert on the extended reception or even later
yeah,
traditions beyond
I'm no
that. But
good at that either, but
so moving on, and I have to bring this up. Ecclesiastes, best book of the Hebrew Bible, in my humble opinion. To me, it's just this fascinating book, opposed to a lot of received wisdom from kind of the religious tradition I grew up with, kind of about who God is and what life is all about. Very kind of iconoclast compared to a lot of the rest of the Bible. But something that I stumbled upon sent me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. So hopefully you can follow me real quick. In chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, I've got Robert Alter's translation here. It says, "If two lie together, they are warm, but as for one, how will he be warm?" In verse 12, "And if one should attack him, the two will stand against him, and the triple cord will not quickly be snapped." So that last bit about the triple cord, Alter notes, and I was not aware of this, it's a quote either from the Epic of Gilgamesh or some similar tradition that they have, but it is basically verbatim, along with several other passages in Ecclesiastes from Gilgamesh. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. In his commentary, Alter says, "It is not necessary to conclude," and this is on verse 11, "it is not necessary to conclude that either marriage or sex is implied by the two laying together, especially since what has been envisaged to this point is the advantage gained through a man's having a companion. The warmth of a shared bed could easily be that of two companions without sexual intent." And this is him, "like Ishmael and Queequeg at the beginning of Moby Dick." Now, that to me is really, that kind of set off some alarm bells for me, because I certainly don't read Moby Dick that way. And Ishmael and Queequeg's relationship has actually been the subject of much speculation about kind of the experiences Herman Melville had with seeing open homosexuality in French Polynesia, as well as kind of his own time on whaling ships, and perhaps a love letter he wrote to, I think, Nathaniel Hawthorne. I love Robert Alter's work, but I immediately went from that and went to his discussion in Samuel. and kind of he also seems to push back against David and Jonathan having any sort of homoerotic imagery at all, even at the beginning of Second Samuel, when David is mourning Jonathan's death and says his love was like that of what's greater for him than that of any woman. And so I guess at least within the first couple of acts that involve his relationship with Enkidu, I'd really love, I'm terrible at pronouncing probably, so forgive me there, but I'd love to hear your perspective on how Gilgamesh and Enkidu, their relationship is portrayed and how kind of affection, attraction, and erotic attachment sort of play into that.
So, well, I'm glad you finally asked that because I was so scared you were going to ask me to speak about Ecclesiastes, a book I know nothing
No,
about.
that's okay. I wanted to bring it around to that. This is kind of where, I went down. That's why I read your book a while ago, is because I went down this path, and I found it, I think, through Jennifer Wright Nust's or is it Kunist? Her book on sex, and I think it's called Unprotected Texts, which is a very cheeky name.
I
It's
don't know
great,
that
but
book.
but
That's a
she
great
cites
title.
some of your work on your book When
Good
Heroes
to
Love,
know.
and so yeah, I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on how we should understand Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and kind of these highly eroticized imagery in antiquity between two men.
So, the book you're referring to, its main title is When Heroes Love. And so, Gilgamesh and Enkidu are two of my heroes. David and Jonathan are my other two heroes. But the subtitle is The Ambiguity of Eros in the Stories of Gilgamesh and David. And I stress the ambiguity because what interested me the most, what still interests me the most, is how ambiguous the language is. And it's not surprising that interpreters in both those cases, the Gilgamesh and Enkidu story and the David and Jonathan story, have read in both directions. Some read, like you say, like Robert Alter, there is no homoerotic imagery. Others read exactly the opposite. And that's because the language is so ambiguous. One of the ways it's ambiguous has to do a little bit with our cultural distance. So, for example, kissing in the ancient world doesn't necessarily carry the erotic connotations we might think of kissing carrying in our world. It kissing is an act of homage, kissing is an act of submission, kissing is an act of loyalty. And so kissing between same-sex partners doesn't necessarily carry eroticism. So there's one way ambiguity happens, but another way ambiguity happens is the texts themselves are quite oblique in terms of the homoerotic language and imagery they use. My own sense is that they're deliberately oblique. Um, my own sense is for Gilgamesh and Enkidu that what that text is trying to do is again work within the context of one of my favorite words, liminal. It's trying to work within a context of liminal time and liminal space, where Gilgamesh and Enkidu really do kind of become separate from their cultural context. They go on these great adventures together, and that outside of that culture and societal context, it's not just that you've broken through the boundaries of your, I don't know, city in Gilgamesh's case, or country or whatever. It's not just that you've broken through those boundaries, but all kinds of other boundaries in terms of normative sexual relations, let's say, kind of begin to erode as well. So, in Moby Dick, we talk about relationships that happen when men are out at sea or when men are away from their families, right? They've broken out of the societally normative worlds that define particular roles and particular ways of being in society. And once you've broken out of that, once you've entered into, again, to use my favorite word, into that kind of liminal time and place, all kinds of other things happen as well. And I think that's one of the things that's going on in Gilgamesh. My favorite chapter in my book about Gilgamesh is called The Liminal Hero. And it's called that precisely because I think once Gilgamesh kind of takes on this more liminal way of living in the world, then again, the intimations about same-sex eroticism become a way of helping signal that liminality.
I'm so glad Alter brought up Moby Dick because to me it was such a good clue to that as well because I feel the same way about that book. And again, one of the things that you brought up earlier to kind of as a very specific example of that for Gilgamesh, and I don't think it's the same for David, but I may be misremembering my Second Samuel. But when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh goes into a period of mourning that is described very much in the same way that we see women's roles in mourning would be taken as well. Now, I don't know that that necessarily applies to David. If I recall correctly, one of the conclusions is that maybe Jonathan is portrayed more as the feminine character to some extent. I know some scholars portray that, but I guess that was just something that I found very interesting. Is kind of like you said, how these roles get reapplied.
Yeah, and in Gilgamesh's case, again, that kind of sense of what a proper masculine role is kind of begins to break down again when he's outside the norms of his culture and society. But it's not his kind of sense of what it is to be human begins to break down, right? He goes off and wanders the steppe as part of his mourning, and the descriptions of him are that he's animal like, right? He's his clothing is tattered. His hair becomes matted and marled and not matted and gnarled, right? Let me say that right. You know, he becomes more animal than human. And again, it's just that in, you know, outside sort of normative social structures, all the things that define normative roles, whether those are gender roles, whether those are sexual roles, whether those are roles about human behavior, those go wonky, and they've gone wonky. Wonky is not a word I used in my book. I just want to be clear about
I think we need
that.
to bring wonky into the academy a bit more. It's such a wonderful word. um, I think one of the things you describe in your book is kind of one of the cool parallels that the redactor or whoever compiled some of these tales of Gilgamesh into the big epic makes is that Gilgamesh in that period sort of starts to resemble in perhaps the reader's mind how Enkidu looked before he was civilized. His clothing is tattered. It starts to resemble even I think you might say a shade from the netherworld. I might be misremembering that.
Yeah, you know, Gilgamesh, Enkidu at the beginning of the epic is very much animal-like. I wouldn't necessarily say shade-like, but he's very much animal-like. To the extent that he runs with the gazelles, right? He runs with the animals. He's the friend of the animals. He releases them from hunters' traps. He's more animal than human. And then after he dies, Gilgamesh kind of becomes that as well. It is true that Gilgamesh, in his wanderings, in these animal-like wanderings, does go to the very ends of the earth. And to that extent, he crosses out of human space. He goes not into the netherworld, but he crosses the waters of death and crosses into a space where humans do not go.
So we do get some glimpses of Enkidu in he's conjured up, much like Saul conjures up a shade of Samuel from the dead in the book of Samuel. I think that's in First Samuel. And I had a friend ask me to ask you this. So this is a special request from a friend of mine. There are sources. It seems to be in some of our sources, like Inanna's descent, and some of Gilgamesh that seem to have been covered in feathers or something that's described almost like feathers. Is there something to that? Do we quite know how they were visualized in the underworld?
There are people who have argued that the dead manifest as avian spirits, as birds.
Interesting.
And it's probably, in my opinion at least, more one of the things you do as a human mourner when somebody dies is you rip your clothes, right? You rip up your clothes. And why do you do that? It's extremely wasteful, but
Expensive in those times too.
right, exactly. But it, along with other behaviors that you do when someone dies, putting dust on your head, covering yourself with ashes, right? The best interpretation, in my opinion, is that it's you become a symbolically identified with the dead person who you're mourning, right? You yourself begin to look like you're dead, and so whatever shroud they're wrapped in is going to decay into tatters. Your clothes need to look like tatters as well. And I suspect that's more where the imagery of sort of feathers comes from, is that whatever clothing the dead are wrapped in begins to disintegrate in such a way that it looks
It's
the
tattered and looks
tatters
almost, yeah.
yeah.
Okay,
I
that's
believe I probably have some ratty jeans that look like that.
yeah, absolutely. I guess my last question is this. So and this kind of feeds into something really interesting is, this idea that you are almost becoming what I think Dan McClellan calls presencing media yourself for the dead. Like you're honoring them, perhaps worshiping them by becoming like this. And even in the death rites, they would, like, lay out the temples. Some of the sorry, graves looked in a similar layout like the temples. They would inscribe names of the person like they do with the gods. They would pour sacrifices and libations at altars inside of these graves like they would do for the gods. And I know that this is something that I believe you had an article that you wrote about it, about kind of the way that feeds into deity worship. My question is this, and this is my pet theory. You can feel free to say it's ridiculous. Please do if it is. Is there a chance that there was a guy named Yahweh who later became, he dies, he gets worshipped, that part of it gets forgotten. He's a person. Do we know of Yahweh or any other gods that we have any suspicions might have actually maybe been a person whose worship grew kind of like Gilgamesh's did? Maybe Gilgamesh was a real king. He's mentioned in a king's list. We're not sure. But is there anything to that idea that a person may have existed behind some of these gods at some point?
Well, you are in good ancient company.
Yeah,
The idea that the gods are deified human heroes or human beings goes back to a Greek philosopher named Euhemerus, so it's called Euhemerism. To think that the origin of gods lie in these kind of larger than life humans who once lived among us as just our neighbors, but they're they have that special, I don't know, whatever it is, charisma that
sure.
makes them makes them more memorable than the rest of us. I myself am not a big fan of that. I couldn't tell you an iota of evidence for it regarding Yahweh. We know of, I mean, the only kind of extra biblical thing we know related to Yahweh is a group of people in the southeast eastern part of what we would today think of as Israel, and then into southwestern Jordan, called the people were a tribal group called the Shasu, but they're called in text the Shasu of Yahoo. Um, and so
And
does
that's
that,
I believe in, I think, a 14th century Egyptian
yes,
inscription, or maybe
right.
even two of them. Yeah.
So, does that mean their God was Yahoo slash Yahweh?
Right. And I think the interesting thing about that is, I believe most scholars don't believe that most of the other Shasu groups, they didn't have names or theophoric elements as part of the inscription, right? It wasn't necessarily the Shasu of Baal, the Shasu of it was
No, no, no.
typically,
We
and so we're not even sure what it's referencing, which is
right.
fascinating.
Right. And it doesn't certainly doesn't have to be a deity's name. I mean, maybe it's a geographical name. We just we don't know. But it seems like to me the Shasu descended from a mighty patriarch who we called Yahoo would be a real stretch. And
Yeah,
that's where you'd have to go
fair enough.
to get what you're looking
I thought
for.
so, but it is just one of those tantalizing things. Like, what if there was a guy, just some guy? But that's why I like to explore it a little bit, get the brain rolling. Fantastic. Well, yes, I guess to the final question that I have for you, what do you think biblical scholarship can do to better kind of represent and explore and understand the people who are behind these texts? The people we're talking about, women, the disabled, the poor, those who don't fit into kind of sexual norms of the era. What do you think biblical scholarship can do to better represent and explore those topics?
Well, in my own career, I've kind of staked myself on thinking of three ways to try and do that. One is to be a kind of underhanded reader of the biblical text. I've said many times I'm interested in reading between the lines. I'm interested in reading against the grain. I certainly am not interested in taking the Bible's word for things if but I'm that and that's a little bit where I get interested in, to take back to the Zipporah example. I'm interested in reading between the lines to say, okay, here's Zipporah, she's performing this circumcision. What if we read between the lines? We think about who she is as a priest's daughter. What does that maybe tell us? Da 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 da. So that's one way I've been interested is trying to be a more subversive reader of text. I personally have been extremely interested in what archaeological evidence can tell us. So I'm quite interested, for example, I didn't mention this, but I'm quite interested in the fact that we have a story in Judges 17 about the shrine that was part of Micah's household. We have some archaeological evidence of shrines that were part of households. So I'm quite interested in the degree to which archaeological evidence can provide a window into some of these things that are talked about in the biblical text. I'm not looking for Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. I'm
For
interested
sure.
in, sort of, okay, we have an allusion in the text to a household shrine. Do we have archaeological evidence for that? Right. And we do. And again, to me, one of the things that says is the biblical writers, excuse me, were generating a text that made sense within the world in which they lived. And rang true in the world in which they lived. And we need to know the world in which we live to know whether it's ringing true or not. And then I have been, and this is, let's say, where the Gilgamesh issue comes in. I've been very interested in the degree to which extra biblical evidence can illuminate the biblical world. We have such a richer corpus of especially textual materials from Mesopotamia than we have from ancient Israel. We have not equally as rich a textual corpus, but a very rich textual corpus from Egypt, much richer than Israel, a much richer corpus from ancient Greece. And so I've been very interested in saying, okay, what can those materials, those extra biblical materials from the neighbors of the ancient Israelites, what can those tell us about ancient Israelite culture? So yeah, so those are always those are my go-to bodies of evidence. The Bible, but as a very suspicious reader of the
Sure,
Bible,
sure.
archaeology, but very interested in more the minutia of archaeology than the big, hey, we found a palace or
Yeah,
hey,
yeah,
we
yeah.
found a gateway and extra biblical text. Those are my kind of go-to things.
Excellent. I guess from there, is there any of your work that you'd like to plug, or anything that you've got coming up that you'd like to advertise here?
Well, I do have a book I'm just finishing right now that, as you were in answer to your last question, this book is very much a part of the, especially looking at extra biblical materials. So the book is on women's life cycle rituals in ancient Israel, and it goes from the birth of a girl child through a young woman's coming of age, through betrothal, through marriage, through pregnancy, motherhood, and then death. Unfortunately, it ends on a kind of downer
It
note.
usually does.
um, but so, for example, I've been very, very interested in thinking about ritual actions that are a part of pregnancy and childbirth, and
Wow.
we can barely say what those might be from the Bible. We can maybe say from Genesis 25 that a woman who's experiencing trouble during her pregnancy, as Rebecca was when she felt this struggle in her womb, would go to a sacred place and try and seek an oracle explaining what's happening to her, right?
Right.
That's I can maybe say that, but
Because of the focus oftentimes on more of the temple purity stuff, we're not always privy to kind of the oracles, the magic, the whatever you want to call it, that they sought out, which is
but
unfortunate.
but we're much more privy to that in Egypt, in
Right.
Mesopotamia, in the Hittite world, in the Canaanite world, in the Greek world. We're much, much more privy to that. And so I've been very interested in the degree to which those traditions can be read in parallel with the biblical tradition to suggest, hey, what is just kind of touched on in this biblical text, or alluded to in this biblical text, is actually a much more widespread tradition within the ancient world, and we could use that to suggest it was widespread in ancient Israel as well, although again, not something the biblical writers are particularly prone to tell us.
And when does that do you anticipate that to be released?
Well, I'm just finishing it, and anyone who has written a scholarly book will tell you it takes ridiculously long to move from finished to publish. It's a year-long process. I never understand why it takes that long. So it'll be out next fall. So when you and I talk next August,
Next time.
we can talk about that.
Absolutely would be thrilled to do that. Well, Professor Susan Ackerman, thank you so much for your time. It's been a phenomenal conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for being so interested in my work, and good luck in your own continued work. Obviously, you're reading a lot, so
Yeah, absolutely.
good
Awesome.
luck. Good luck in keeping that up. Thank you.
I was riding on the Mayflower.